Samson is perhaps the most mythical of all the characters in the Bible. In many ways, he feels like an icon for the masculine tragedy. A man with incredible potential and even greater strength, Samson shines like the sun and burns down any obstacle in his way. The only thing greater than his strength and his muscles is his desire and love for a woman. If Samson is like an ancient version of Superman, then his kryptonite is woman. But here's the kicker. Samson's addicted to his little green rock. His greatest undoing is something that he actually desires and cannot get enough of. In a reversal of so many of our modern-day masculine characters like James Bond and Indiana Jones, the sheriff of this story saves the day, kills the Nazis, but then when he gets the girl, he gives away his greatest weakness and tragically dies. Today, we are talking about the Superman, or the All Might of the Bible, Samson, and the flower that is his kryptonite, Delilah. Here we go. So we're continuing our discussion about Samson. Today we're going to be talking about the most famous parts of this strongman story, Samson and the donkey's jawbone, Samson and Delilah, and consequently, Samson's ultimate demise. But before we do, let's do a little bit of a review so we can remember where we've come from so far and stage our time today. So, Samson was a Nazirite for life, right? This means that he was placed under an extraordinary vow in service to God for his whole life. And that service and purpose was that Samson was to begin to save the Israelites from their Philistine oppressors. At the heart of this vow that was placed on Samson was 3 rules. The Nazirite vow involved 3 things that you couldn't do. You couldn't drink any wine. This meant you couldn't consume any grapes, any grape juice, grape seeds, not even grape skins. Samson could also not touch any ritually unclean bodies, any dead bodies or anything that would make him ritually unclean. Lastly, and most importantly, the most secretive part of this vow is that Samson could not cut his hair. If you remember, the Hebrew word Nazir, which the vow, the Nazirite vow comes from, meant both consecrated and crown. To consecrate something and something's crown. So the hair of someone who took on the Nazirite vow seemed to be the special symbol of this crown of devotion to God for whatever time period they had set aside to be devoted to God. Samson has already broken one part of his vow when he eats some of the honey that came from a beehive that was growing out of a dead lion. Of all places, he does this in a vineyard. Samson has also just been widowed. He married a wife who was a Philistine, so his wife was from the very people who were oppressing Samson and whom he was called and set aside to save Israel from. So he marries essentially the enemy, a woman of the people who are oppressing him. And to make a long story short, Samson has some divinely ordained hostility toward these Philistines that starts off with a bet from his wife's kinsman during their wedding, like their marriage ceremony, which was a week long. This bet turned sour. Samson gave him a riddle they couldn't solve, and during the wedding, they secretly threatened to burn his wife's house down if she didn't help them solve the riddle. So she begs Samson to tell her. He does. Then she tells the groomsmen, and they in turn win the bet. Samson knows the only way they could have won is through his wife, because she was the only one he told the answer to this riddle to. So he kills 30 of these Philistines' own countrymen to pay off the debt of the bet. He takes the clothes off of the dead men and gives them to his groomsmen. This sends a message to them that Samson won't be punked or punished by the Philistines. Eventually, Samson goes back and tries to reconcile with his wife because, well, needless to say, they had some marital and communication issues to start off their marriage. But when he comes back, her father won't let Samson see her and informs him that she's already been remarried off to one of the best men in his wedding. So Samson is understandably angry, and he sets fire to the Philistines' crops and fields in an act of vengeance. The Philistines then respond in their own act of vengeance and set fire to his wife and his father-in-law. Samson then does his own act of vengeance in response and attacks and kills some more of them. Literally, we're told that he struck them hip on thigh. So he beat them up like a bunch of accordions. If you've played a lot of video games, maybe this looked like what happens when you turn on the ragdoll physics in a game. Now, after each step of vengeance, Samson seems to think he will finally be even with his enemies, or that the last act of vengeance will be the end of the violence. But with each passing act of vengeance, Samson is simultaneously deepening the cycles and also beginning to save Israel as well. So he's deepening the cycles of vengeance and also beginning to save Israel from their oppressors at the same time. And it's like this divinely orchestrated, vicious cycle of vengeance. Okay, now Samson, he just struck the Philistines hip on thigh, like some ragdoll physics, like an accordion, and he's gone to this place called the Rock of Atam, and he's gone in a cleft in this rock. And Atam means something like the Rock of the Beast Slayer in Hebrew. I think he has gone here to mourn the loss of his wife and to get alone and away from all of this violence. He wants the vengeance and the violence to end. I think he's just kind of tired and wants to mourn. That's my interpretation, at least. Either way, Samson is brooding and alone like an angry, lonely lion or a beast in his den. And this is where we're going to pick up our story today. Judges 15, starting in verse 9. Then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out at Lehi. So the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Atam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hand of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not kill me." And so they said to him, "No, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands. Yet surely enough, we will not put you to death." Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him, and the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds melted from his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so he sent forth his hand and took it and struck down 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've struck down 1,000 men. Now it happened when he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named the place Ramoth Lehi. Then he became thirsty, and he called to Yahweh and said, "You have given this great salvation by the hand of your slave. But now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out of it. And then he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he named it Ein Hakor, or the spring of him who called out, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Okay, so Samson's been living at this rock of Atam for some time. We're not told how long he is. We're just told that he goes there, and then eventually some Philistines figure out he's there, and then his own countrymen, some Judeans, approach him, and they essentially ask him, "Why are you attacking these Philistines? Don't you know that they rule over us?" Now, I find that really interesting and ironic because it seems pretty clear so far that Yahweh actually wants Israel to fight back against their oppressors. So much so that he's willing to use a really flawed individual like Samson to attack the Philistines in this bitter cycle of vengeance. Interestingly, the reasoning Samson gives the Judeans for his actions mirrors what the Philistines tell the Judeans about their intentions towards Samson. So, the Philistines explain to the Judeans, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he has done to us." In response, to the Judeans' question about why Samson would attack their oppressors, he says to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." So they both say, "Hey, we're here to do to the other party what they have done to us." We see here that the cycle of vengeance is recurring again. Samson thinks he is getting even with the Philistines, and the Philistines also think they're getting even with Samson. But each time one party retaliates against the other, they are doing greater and greater damage and perpetuating the cycle of vengeance further. It's also worth noting here that the Judeans bring 3,000 men to bind up Samson, but Samson only ends up killing 1,000 Philistines. So it seems like the Judeans outnumber the Philistines 3-1, right? Why didn't they just tell the Philistines to leave? They have more men, they have more resources. It seems like Samson's fellow Israelites have all but given up hopes of any rebellion or independence from their overlords. It is like the Judeans themselves are so defeated that they have accepted life and rule under the thumb of the Philistines. And here again, Samson seems to be the only one who is willing to stand up against these oppressors. So the Judeans bind up Samson and lead him to this place called Lehi, or jawbone in Hebrew. And here it's time for our obligatory anime reference of the week. I think that Samson's fighting in this scene, it looks like he's going Super Saiyan. Or better yet, it looks like we see Ultra Instinct Samson here. Like Samson's going over 9,000. While it may seem a bit silly to imagine Samson like a character from Dragon Ball Z who's going Super Saiyan, I actually think the idea of Samson going Super Saiyan is a great idea and a great analogy here, because the language used to describe how the spirit rushes on Samson and how he breaks free from his bonds is very fiery in nature. So let me explain. We're told that the ropes tied around Samson becomes like flax that is burned in fire, and his bonds are said to melt away. Then, in still more of an anime fashion, Samson kills 1,000 enemies with something that should be a weapon, that should not be a weapon, the jawbone of a donkey. This is like when John Wick kills 3 people with a pencil, or if you've ever watched the show Hunter x Hunter, there's a character named Killua who kills his enemies with like a really heavy yo-yo, right? It's like that shouldn't be a weapon, but he's so skilled and so strong, he can kill 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Here would be a really great time to mention that Samson's name in Hebrew means Shimshon, and Shimshon looks very similar to the Hebrew word Shemesh, which means sun. In fact, it looks like Samson's name comes directly from the word sun in Hebrew. So I think a good translation of Samson's name is actually something like sunny. I actually think this is also a really fitting name for Samson, Shimshon, or if you want to call him Sunny. First, because Samson seems to burn through his restraints in this fight. Yes, it's obvious. But secondly, Samson seems to have a very fiery, bright, and chaotic personality in his life. He's very brash. He takes what he wants. His birth is announced by an angel who ascends through the flames of a sacrifice into the heavens. Most importantly, Samson is like a sun that burns brightly with passion, bravery, and vengeance, but which is also very quickly extinguished by the woman in his life. Okay, so that's Samson in his name. It's Ultra Instinct Samson. He kills 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone in what was probably an epic, fiery, anime-esque battle. And then he celebrates fittingly in this poetic song. He says, or he sings, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've struck down 1,000 men. Now, I actually think that this little poem is really cool. First of all, it's worth noting that the Hebrew word that is translated here as heaps is hamorah, which sounds a lot like the Hebrew word hamor, which is donkey. So you can see that it is really fitting for Samson to celebrate with a poem here, because just like his riddle at the wedding, this is also a riddle for the reader now. It's a little small riddle. Samson is using a pun in a poetic form. He's saying literally, with the lehi of a hamoratayim. Or to put it more simply, with the jawbone of a hamor, I've stacked hamora upon hamora. It's also worth noting here that the repeating lines with the jawbone of a donkey, the first and the third lines of the poem, are exactly the same, right? So the first and the third lines in this poem are the exact same words. They both say with the jawbone of a donkey. This has the effect of emphasizing the lines that are not the same. So it puts emphasis on the second and fourth lines. Because those lines are different, they stick out a little bit more. The second line is a pun on a donkey. Heaps upon heaps, a chamorah upon chamorah. But the fourth line reveals to us the scene. What are all these donkey heaps, right? What are these heaps that sound like donkeys? They are piles and piles of dead Philistines. I hope that makes sense. Essentially, Samson's using a pun to say that he piled up dunes upon dunes of dead donkeys. In other words, he's calling these Philistines donkeys, which is surely an insult, and he just killed them with a donkey's jawbone. Okay, next, in this next part, I think is kind of interesting. It's eerily similar to another story I remember reading about. Samson becomes very thirsty. Killing 1,000 men will make you really thirsty, right? He calls out to Yahweh and says, "You have given great salvation by the hand of your servant, and now I am going to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised." So God responds to Samson by splitting open a hollow place in Lehi, and water gushes out from that hollow place. The Hebrew word for hollow here means something like a cup. The only other time this word is used in the Bible is in Proverbs 27:22. In that proverb, this word describes a mortar and a pestle. This word describes specifically the mortar, right? The stone bowl which the pestle pounds the ingredients in. So this hollow is like a valley or a natural area where a spring could flow out of at Lehi. Maybe some sort of rock formation. Not entirely clear. What is interesting to me is that this appears to be some sort of concave rock formation, and Samson was just in another cleft in a rock formation earlier. So here's my very open to interpretation, and it could be wrong, Bible conspiracy theory of the week. So here's my Bible conspiracy of the week. I'm not super attached to this theory, but this is what I think is going on. I think that this hollow place in Lehi, where water gushes forth from, is like a bookend in the story, showing us that Samson starts out in a low place in a cleft in a rock called a tom, a wild beast slayer, and then he ends up in what will be called Ein Hakor, which means the spring of the one who called out, because Samson called out for God's help and God responded by bringing life-saving water. So in other words, it feels like Samson starts out the story in a cleft, which is a dry, dead layer of the beast. And then by the end of the story, Samson finds himself in another cleft that is the source of a spring of living water provided for by God's abundant grace. So I think what's happening here is Samson starts the story in a cleft of a beast layer, and then he ends the story with water coming out of a cleft, providing him life-saving nourishment, so he can catch it, so he doesn't die of thirst. Okay, I'd also be remiss here if I didn't mention a note that Robert Alter makes in his commentary of the Judges. That note is about the word hakor. Hakor in Hebrew is a homonym. A homonym is a fancy way of saying that this word has a double meaning. It can mean both the one who calls out, but it can also mean partridge. So hakor can mean one who calls out, or it can also mean a partridge, denoting a bird. So the spring was probably an actual real spring in ancient Israel, and Alter believes it was most likely known originally as the partridge spring, but cleverly the authors here seem to have interwoven Samson's story into the origins of this spring and have given it theological significance, with the other possible meaning of the spring's name as the one who calls out. Pretty cool. This is either the partridge spring or the spring of one who calls out, depending on how you choose to interpret the word. I'd also like to note that there is some interesting wording used when God answers Samson's prayer and gives him water. The authors say that water came out and he drank and his spirit returned and he revived. Now this is an interesting flow of thought. Particularly the word spirit is something worth noting here. This word in Hebrew is the word ruach. Now I should do a whole episode over the word ruach, but long story short, ruach in Hebrew can mean breath, spirit, or wind. And oftentimes it's translated as spirit, like the Holy Spirit is actually the Holy Ruach. And the idea here and the idea behind Ruach in the Bible is that the Ruach is this life-giving force of this life force, of all living creatures. It is also the energy of pretty much most things in creation. It animates everything. At the beginning of the story, the Holy Ruach, right, this animating life force directly from God, rushes upon Samuel when he sees the Philistines. Now, at the end of the battle, Samson's own Ruach returns back to him when he is refreshed by God's life-giving water. So the Holy Ruach, or Holy Spirit, rushed upon Samson like a powerful stream, and then Samson drinks from a spring or a well of water and catches his Ruach, or his breath, so to speak. It is like his this life force is drained at the end of the battle, but God provided a divine, holy life force that pushed Samson to fight the Philistines in the first place. So even though he receives this divine energy or spirit, Samson's still mortal, right? He still needs to be refreshed and revived after the battle. This calling out for water and this spring of calling out bookends the battle with God providing the Holy Ruach, or Holy Spirit, to Samson, both to fight his enemies and then also in the form of providing living water to save his life and restore his Ruach, or his breath, when he's dying of thirst. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so before I begin the story of Samson and Delilah, there is a smaller story that's sandwiched in between these stories of the donkey's jawbone and Delilah. This story is in the beginning of chapter 16, and while it feels a little out of place with the rest of the narrative flow, I think it's still important, worth going over. This story is about Samson going down to Gaza and sleeping with a prostitute woman. This is what the story says. Then Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. And they kept silent all night. Let us wait until the morning light, then we will come and kill him. But Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and seized the doors of the city gate and the two posts and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and brought them up to the top of the mountain which is opposite Hebron. Okay, so the inhabitants of Gaza see Samson going into town and sleeping with a prostitute. So they plot all night to try to kill him, right? He's their enemy and they haven't been able to best him. For some reason, Samson just gets up at midnight. We're not told if he hears them or if he suspects something. He just gets up at midnight, tears the gates off of their hinges, and carries them all the way to Hebron and places them on a mountain. It's probably like a hill that faced the city of Hebron. That's it. That's the end of the story. At first glance, this feels like a filler episode in an anime. If you don't know, a filler episode in an anime is like an episode that doesn't move the plot along. It's like they need more time to actually do work on the episodes that have plot and that actually matter to the storyline. So they just give you these filler episodes that don't really progress the plot forward at all. Okay, this feels like a little bit of a filler episode. However, I think there are some small details here that color Samson's character a little bit more and add to his character and to the story. First of all, if you know your ancient Israelite geography, then this story makes a bit more sense. Gaza was a town on the coast of Israel. Hebron was a city in the heart of the Judean territory, so it's in the heart of Israel. So it's a more than a couple of miles away from Gaza. The city gates in ancient times were the primary means that the city had to protect itself. Really, it was the way that you controlled who came in and out of the city. Makes sense, right? If you have a wall around your city, then the gate is how you control who can come in and who can go out. So for Samson to just rip off the gates of the city was the equivalent of him ripping off like some person's front door, right? And then he just takes those gates all the way back to his neighborhood and effectively sends the Philistines a message. You think I'm not safe in your city? You're not even safe in your own city. I'm going to take away your safety net, your like city door, which protects you. So this wasn't entirely a filler episode. I think this story serves a little bit to show how unafraid Samson was toward the Philistines. Just how like fearless, how he didn't fear them at all. It shows us also another little fall narrative for Samson. He's just sleeping with a prostitute woman here, right? Like, takes yet again another woman. And I think that's for some reason God sides with Samson here yet again, probably again because Samson's absolutely not afraid of his oppressors. Additionally, this prostitute is the second unnamed woman in Samson's life that stirs up hostility between him and the Philistines. All three of Samson's romantic partners in his life will stir up hostility between him and the Philistines. And now we're going to get to the third named woman in Samson's life. So the first two are unnamed. This last one is named. We're going to get into the story of Samson and Delilah. So we're going to be in Judges 16, starting in verse 4. Now it happened afterwards that he loved a woman in the valley of the vine, and her name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, "Entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please, tell me where your strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you." Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, I will become weak and will be like any other man." Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in wait, sitting in a room, and she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the cords as a string of tinder snaps when it smells fire. So his strength was still not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, If you bind me tightly with new ropes which have not been used for work, then I will become weak like any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Now the men lying in wait were sitting in the inner room, but he snapped the ropes of his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I will become weak like any other man." So, while he slept, Delilah took 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web. And she fastened it with the pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But when he awoke from his sleep, he pulled out the pin of the loom and the web. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times, and have not told me where your great strength is." Now it happened when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me. I will become weak and be like every other man." And Delilah saw that he told her all that was in his heart. So she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came to her and brought up the silver in their hands. Then she made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as the other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that Yahweh had left him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. So this story begins by telling us that Samson loved a woman in a place called literally the choice valley of the choice valley of the vine, or as I like to call it, the valley of the vine. What is so sad about this story is that Samson is never said to have loved any other woman in his life. We are not told that he was married to Delilah, but it seems like Samson may be trying to settle down. It should also be noted that the Valley of the Vine, or Nahal Sorek in Hebrew, is, according to some scholars, located within Israelite territory. So this means that Samson may finally be pursuing a romantic relationship with an Israelite woman. We should remember his parents pushed back against Samson wanting to marry a Timnite or a Philistine woman. The fact that this could be an Israelite woman makes this story all the more tragic. Samson finally falls in love with a woman who should be a suitable wife for him. But she is anything but a suitable wife. If this shows us anything, it's that you can marry the wrong person from the right faith and the right community. Just because they follow Jesus doesn't mean they're the right one for you. Okay, so I should also note that Delilah being in the Valley of the Vine maps well onto Samson's whole ordeal where he killed a lion in a vineyard on his way to get engaged to his first wife. Back then, there was a lot of Edenic and forbidden fruit language, suggesting subtly that Samson's choice to marry the Philistine woman was the wrong one. Here, the fact that Delilah is a woman, she's called a woman at first, in the Valley of the Vine, suggests that Samson is making another bad choice that could amount to him taking of the forbidden fruit yet again. Almost as soon as this story begins, Delilah is betraying Samson. After the first sentence introducing her, we are told that the Philistine overlords approached her and said to her, "Entice him and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him so that we may bind him to afflict him." Okay, so even though Samson is said to love Delilah, we are not told that she loves him back. In fact, quite the opposite is probably true. Delilah is immediately willing to sell him out and betray him, knowing that he would be tortured by his enemies. Oh, and one more thing to note before we move on. Delilah's name is kind of important. She's the only woman in Samson's life who's given a name. Not even Samson's mom is given a name, right? This has the effect of personalizing this betrayal even more. Delilah's name comes from the Hebrew word dalal, which means to languish or to hang low. Dalal is oftentimes used in the Bible when a person or a group of people is said to be brought low. So Delilah probably means something like low hanger. Some dictionaries translated the meaning of this name as feeble, weak, or delicate. I like the definition weak a lot because Delilah is the only woman who is named in Samson's life, is the only one who truly weakens him the most. She actually is like his kryptonite. She, of all the women in Samson's life that, bring him low, Delilah is the only one who actually brings him low and takes away his strength. So Delilah is given this, her name's weakness, right? You could say that it means something like weakness, and immediately we see that she's getting to work on betraying Samson and trying to figure out his weakness. She goes straight to the point. You may notice that there are some patterns emerging in this interplay between Delilah and Samson, where Delilah asks Samson about his weakness and he lies to her. So let's explore some of those patterns for a little bit. First of all, Samson lies to Delilah 3 times. We should remember that 3 in the Bible is a number of testing and salvation. So what's the test here? I think the test here is Samson not giving up the secret to his power, and that the secret is in his hair, right? The test is that he should not tell Delilah about his secret. So he seems to pass that test the first 3 times, but he's starting to dangle around with this test a little too closely, and then finally on the 4th time around, he fails the test. Also, notice how all of Samson's lies have something to do with 7, or rest. First, Samson tells Delilah that 7 moist cords would take away his strength. Then it's cords that have never been used for work. And then he tells her that she needs to weave together his 7 braids of hair on his head and put them in a pin. I should remind us here that the word 7, or shavah in Hebrew, is a homonym as well. It can mean both the number 7, but it can also mean covenant. If you remember, Be'er Shavah is a covenant, is a well of the covenant, or a well of 7, because Abraham gave a guy named Avimelech 7 ewe lambs, and they made a covenant there that Abraham was like buying the well. So here, Samson is dancing around and playing with the secret to what completes him and what brings him strength. That secret lies in his covenant with God. In other words, 7 is a number that denotes both rest and completion and also covenants. Samson is dancing around with where God rests in his life and where God meets with him and where his covenant with God resides. It is also interesting and very fitting that while the first 3 answers Samson gives are about 7 or rest, when his head is finally shaved by Delilah, it is done when Samson is fast asleep when he is resting on Delilah's lap. He is vulnerable and at rest with the woman he loves when he is betrayed and loses his symbol of rest and his symbol of his covenant with God. Okay, this story then is a commentary on getting too close to the wrong person in a romantic relationship. It is a warning on giving away your kryptonite to the wrong person in life. But this is where the analogy to Superman breaks down a little bit. I've compared Samson to Superman because with Superman, his kryptonite is only his greatest weakness. Superman doesn't like kryptonite. He tries to get as far away from that stuff as possible. With Samson, his hair is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. This is often the case with our own weaknesses, and even for a lot of people, our own romantic partners in life, the people that we choose in life. As a side note, this is a very nerdy tangent. When researching this, I've compared Samson to Superman a lot. I think that's a really good comparison. But there's also another good comparison, and that is a character I mentioned earlier in this podcast from an anime called My Hero Academia. That character's name is All Might. He is essentially the Japanese version of Superman. And while he doesn't have like a kryptonite, this little green rock that like saps his power, he has a superpower that is passed down from one generation to the next generation. And the secret to passing on this power is through someone eating, of all things, some of All Might's hair. So while Samson carries a lot of similarities in my mind to Superman, it almost feels like this Japanese version of Superman carries with him some similarities to Samson, right? Like All Might's kind of like has a little bit of allusions to Samson in his own character, and that the secret to passing down his power is through someone eating his hair. Kind of cool. Okay, nerdy anime reference over. Back to our story about Samson's weakness being in his hair and the connection to his weakness in choosing the right romantic partners in his life. When someone knows how you tick, when they know what you are made up of, it is like they can play you like a Jenga tower. They know exactly which blocks to pull out of you to make you crumble, but they know exactly which places of the tower needs to be reinforced. In other words, they have the power to help you become your best or worst self because they know what motivates you, what empowers you, and what hurts and damages you. They know what makes you feel secure and what makes you feel insecure. And where does this desire for Samson's own kryptonite come from? Well, poetically, in this story, it comes from Samson's heart. I should explain. So after the third failed attempt to find Samson's weakness, Delilah tells him, "You only say I love you, but your heart is not with me." There's a few things to note here. First, we get an insight to their relationship. Samson said the L word. He got past a pretty big milestone in the relationship. He said, "I love you." He's gotten past a really, taken a step in their relationship. That's not my point here. Delilah says that Samson's heart is not with her. He says that he loves her, but she doesn't feel like he loves her. I think we intuitively know what this means. Delilah is telling Samson he only says he loves her, but she needs more. She needs to know that he trusts her. Part of doing that in a relationship is giving up your kryptonite to the other person, right? This means being vulnerable with them and letting them get close to you so they can either help you and walk with you and partner with you and lift you up, or if you give them that kryptonite and that vulnerability, they can tear you down. So back to the story. We're told that Samson, in response to Delilah's complaints, told her all that was in his heart. It's worth noting, it's only after he was annoyed to death. So I should also talk about the heart in the biblical authors' understanding of the heart versus our understanding of the heart. Essentially, the biblical authors thought of the heart as a kind of combination of one's inner emotional and mental seat. We think of the heart as our inner seat of emotion only. The Hebrews thought of the heart as a place where decisions were made and mental work was happening. It really was more akin to the biology of our brains. So Samson telling Delilah all that was in his heart was not just him becoming emotionally vulnerable with her, right? It was also him showing all of himself, divulging the secrets that only one other person in his life knew. That person was Samson's mother. This phrase, all that was in his heart, is repeated twice in their ensuing narrative, and that further emphasizes this point that Samson is giving up the deepest part of him. And that is not just like his emotional, like, vulnerability to Delilah. That's actually the physical secret or the intellectual secret that Samson's hair is a secret to his power and his strength. So Samson is giving up his holiness and his crown of consecration to God by telling Delilah where his strength lies. Okay, so once Samson gives Delilah all that was in his heart, the secret to his power, she cuts off his hair and hands him over to the Philistines, who sadly and very fittingly gouge out Samson's eyes. The man who always took the woman he saw in his life has now been blinded by the actions of the only woman he's ever said to love. So he saw all these women, he was able to take whatever woman he wanted in his life, and now the woman that he really wanted, that he really loved, takes away his sight. And now the Philistines take him back, very fittingly again, to Gaza, the city where he ripped off their gates and took them back into his own neighborhood, his own country. Okay, let's keep going in this story because there's still a little bit left to go. Judges 16, verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to be glad. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. Then the people saw him and praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. So it happened, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house is established, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to Yahweh and said, O Lord Yahweh, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. So Samson grabbed the 2 middle pillars on which the house was established and supported himself against them. Then the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with his strength so that the house fell on the lords of all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he put to death by his death were more than those whom he put to death in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, carried him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, and the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he judged Israel 20 years. Okay, so there's really just one big takeaway from this tragic ending to this story, and that's this. All it takes is a buzz cut's worth of devotion, a sliver of faith, a microscopic crown of consecration in order to tear strongholds down. That's how powerful devotion and consecration are, and that's how redeeming faith can be. Even if you feel like you've hit rock bottom like Samson has here, even if you feel like you've been completely thrown away your holiness and devotion to the Lord, there is still always hope. If you would just start with a week, a day, an hour, even a minute, God can work with that. You can always start over in your purity. You can always start over with your anger. You can always start over with your words, with your trust issues, with your substance abuse. Whatever it is, you can always start over and always turn back to God. I think the message of the end of Samson's story is to never diminish the power of the little decisions in your life. Samson got to this point in life by the little decisions he made over the course of the 20 years that he was the judge over Israel, the sheriff. It was a compounding of small choices that Samson consistently made that caused him to eventually give up the secret of the source of his power and his devotion to God. Conversely, it was also in one singular moment where Samson chose to not give up that he accomplished more of his extraordinary covenant with God than in his whole life. He killed more Philistines in this one act of I guess you could call it vengeance again. This one moment decision where said he wasn't going to give up and he called out to God. He killed more Philistines in that moment than in his whole life. It was lots of little moments that led to Samson's greatest downfall, but it was also a singular moment of faith that brought about his greatest victory. I think that is where Samson's story leaves us, with both warnings and assurances for those that would embark on a Nazirite vow, that for those that would embark on doing something that is pala, or extraordinary and noble for God. Okay, that was a lot. Here I think it might be helpful to summarize Samson's story so far, because I feel like we've covered a lot with this story. So Samson is really the characteristic mythological tale of the masculine tragedy, in my opinion. I actually believe that Samson embodies the masculine spirit more than any other character in the Bible. I say this because Samson is brave. He stands up to the bullies that no one else will. He is cunning and witty, full of quips, puns, and poetic trash talk his whole life. Samson is strong. No one and nothing can bind him. No ropes, no soldiers or lions or chains can contain this man. Not even the gates of a city can keep him contained. The only thing that can hold him down, the only thing that can bind him, are women. It is a woman, his mother at the beginning of his life, who is entrusted with the secret to his powers. His first wife's death sends him spiraling down into the cleft of the rock of the wild beast. And his third lover, Delilah, is the only one in the story who is able to take away his powers and bind him up. It is in Samson's most intimate relationships that he fails, that he gives up his secret, which was only supposed to be between him and God. In other words, through his intimacy with woman, he gives up his intimacy with God and loses the source of his strength, his crown of consecration, and his devotion to the Lord. I find that last part particularly interesting because normally it is the feminine spirit and the myths of the female heroines which highly praise and puts a premium on virginity, purity, and sexual fidelity. Here, not only is Samson's sexual fidelity his kryptonite, it is the thing that's put on a premium. It's tightly linked to the purity of his devotion towards God. Nothing quite ignites a man like a beautiful woman, and nothing quite extinguishes a man like a beautiful woman. Samson is such a relatable character in that he is the chosen one. He is the man called to do an extraordinary vow, called to be a savior for his people before he was even born. Yet he is also a rebel. He does what he wants. He is extremely confident because he is strong and everyone else knows it. He is the alpha. He's the proverbial Michael Jordan of his era. Samson represents what all men aspire to be and what all men fear to be undone by: vengeance and sexual promiscuity. For me, this story is sobering because, like a lot of men, I feel like I can relate to the aspirational qualities of Samson as well as the epic failures of Samson. My idol of choice has historically been lust and women, and I've had my fair share of mountaintop moments as well as spectacular failings in the realm of my purity and my romantic relationships. For me, Samson is both a calling and a warning. A calling to aspire to do extraordinary and difficult things, to be consecrated and devoted to the Lord, and a warning to not be undone by the things that are, for me, kryptonite. But within this masculine tragedy, I believe there's so much grace because God still chooses to use Samson despite his sin and failures. When Samson has lost his proverbial crown, when all his years of devotion have gone out the window, all it takes is a buzz cut of hair, a shred of devotion to move mountains and demolish strongholds. That is Samson's life, but that is not the end of his story. Next time, we are going to talk about an often overlooked part of Samson's story. Next time, we are covering the prequel to this tragedy. That's right. In the following chapters, we will learn about the circumstances that set up Samson's life and propelled God to choose to move through Samson and his family. Looking forward to that. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you all next time.